The snow fell in relentless sheets across the mountain pass that February morning in 1884, and Thea Carson's legs finally gave out just as the first pale light of dawn crept over the peaks. She had been walking for 3 days with nothing but a handful of pine nuts and melted snow to sustain her, and now her body simply refused to carry her another step. The world tilted sideways, the white landscape spinning into a blur of gray and cold, and then she was falling face first into the snowdrift beside the trail, her carpet bag tumbling from her frozen fingers. The last thought that crossed her mind before darkness claimed her was that this was a foolish way to die, alone in the Colorado wilderness at 22 years old, all because she had believed the lies of a man who promised her a teaching position in a town that did not exist. Mason Lawson had been tracking the mountain lion since before sunrise, following its prints through the fresh powder that had fallen overnight. The big cat had taken down two of his calves in the past week, and he was determined to end the threat before it cost him any more livestock. His ranch sat in a valley just outside Telluride, and he knew these mountains better than most men knew their own faces in the mirror. At 27, he had spent nearly a decade carving out a life in this unforgiving country, and he had learned to read the land the way other men read newspapers. That was why the dark shape in the snowdrift caught his attention immediately, a splash of burgundy fabric against the pristine white that did not belong in this wilderness. He urged his horse forward, his rifle ready in case the mountain lion had claimed a victim, but as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a woman, her face pressed into the snow, her dark hair matted with ice, her traveling dress soaked through and frozen stiff. Mason was off his horse in an instant, dropping to his knees beside her and turning her over with careful hands. Her skin was pale as milk, her lips tinged blue, but when he pressed his fingers to her throat, he felt the faint flutter of a pulse. "Come on, lady," he said, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You are not dying on me today." He gathered her into his arms, startled by how light she was, how her bones pressed sharp against his hands through the layers of wet fabric. She was dangerously thin, he realized, not just frozen but starving. He whistled for his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger, and somehow managed to haul himself and his unconscious burden into the saddle. The mountain lion would have to wait. This woman needed help now, or she would not see another sunset. The ride back to his ranch took nearly an hour, and by the time Mason kicked open the door to his cabin, his arms were burning with the effort of holding her. He carried her straight to his bedroom, the only room in the small house with a proper bed and a stove he could stoke to blazing heat. He laid her on the quilts his mother had made before she passed, then set about building up the fire until the room was almost uncomfortably warm. Getting her out of the frozen dress was harder than he expected. His fingers fumbled with the tiny buttons and hooks, and he had to cut through several layers with his knife when the fabric proved too stiff to remove. He tried to be respectful, averting his eyes as much as possible, but he could not help noticing the way her ribs stood out beneath her chemise, the hollows at her collarbones, the way her wrists looked fragile enough to snap. She had been hungry for far longer than 3 days, he thought grimly. Once he had her wrapped in dry blankets and long underwear from his own drawer, Mason went to work, warming her hands and feet with gentle massage, trying to restore circulation without causing more damage. He had seen frostbite before, had even lost 2 toes to it himself in his first winter in Colorado, and he knew that patience was as important as warmth. While he worked, he studied her face properly for the first time. She was beautiful in a delicate way that seemed completely unsuited to this harsh country, with fine features and long lashes that lay dark against her pale cheeks. She looked like she belonged in a drawing room somewhere back east, not half dead in a snowdrift in the Rocky Mountains. It took nearly 2 hours before she stirred, and when her eyelids finally fluttered open, Mason found himself looking into eyes the color of warm honey. She stared at him in confusion, her gaze unfocused, and tried to speak, but only managed a cracked whisper. "Water," he said, reaching for the cup he had prepared. "Just small sips now. Easy does it." He supported her head with one hand and held the cup to her lips with the other, letting her take tiny swallows until she turned her face away. She looked around the unfamiliar room. and he saw panic beginning to dawn in her expression. "You are safe," Mason said quickly. "I found you in the snow this morning. You were nearly frozen. My name is Mason Lawson, and this is my ranch outside Telluride. You are in my bedroom because it is the warmest room in the house, but I promise you have my word as a gentleman that I mean you no harm." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his weather-beaten face, his honest eyes, the concern evident in his expression. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her body. "Thea," she whispered, Thea Carson. "Well, Miss Carson, can you tell me what you were doing out in that pass alone? That is dangerous country, even for men who know it well." Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away. "I was walking to Telluride. A man in Denver told me there was a teaching position waiting for me there. He arranged my train ticket, gave me directions. But when I arrived at the station where he said someone would meet me, there was no one. I waited for hours, but the station master said there was no school looking for teachers, no one who had sent for me. I realized I had been swindled. The man had taken nearly all my money for the ticket and the supposed introductions." Mason felt anger kindle in his chest. He had seen this before. Unscrupulous men preying on women traveling alone, taking their money and leaving them stranded. "You should have stayed in town," he said gently. "Telluride is rough, but there are decent people there who would have helped you." "I had no money for lodging," Thea said, her voice gaining a little strength. "Only a few dollars left, and I thought if I could just get to Telluride proper, I might find work. But I got lost in the mountains. The trail split, and I took the wrong path. By the time I realized my mistake, I was too far gone to turn back. I ran out of food. I knew I was going to die out there." "But you did not," Mason said firmly. "You survived, and now you are going to get well. First things first, though. You need something in your stomach. I am going to make you some broth. Your body cannot handle solid food yet, not after starving like that, but we will get you built back up." He left her to rest while he went to the kitchen. A small room dominated by a massive iron stove and a rough-hewn table. He set a pot of beef bones and vegetables to simmering, then checked on his ranch hands to make sure they could handle the work without him for the day. His foreman, an older man named Walt, took one look at Mason's face and told him to stay put and take care of his guest. Over the next several days, Mason nursed Thea with a patience he had not known he possessed. He fed her spoonfuls of broth every few hours, gradually introducing soft foods like oatmeal and mashed potatoes. He changed the bandages on her frostbitten fingers and toes, relieved when it became clear she would not lose any of them. He moved his bedroll to the main room and slept by the fire, giving her privacy while still remaining close enough to hear if she needed help in the night. As her strength returned, Thea began to talk more, and Mason found himself looking forward to their conversations. She told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had died when she was 15, leaving her mother to struggle to make ends meet. She had worked as a seamstress and a governess, dreaming of becoming a teacher, saving every penny she could. When her mother passed 2 years ago, Thea had been left alone in the world with only her determination to make something of herself. "I was so foolish," she said one evening, as Mason sat beside the bed, mending a bridle while she sipped tea. "I should have known it was too good to be true. A teaching position with good pay and room and board included. Only a naive fool would believe such an offer without questioning it." "You were not foolish," Mason said, looking up from his work. "You were hopeful, and there is nothing wrong with that. The man who deceived you is the one at fault, not you." Thea studied him over the rim of her teacup, and Mason felt something shift in the air between them. In the soft lamplight, with color finally returning to her cheeks and her hair washed and braided over one shoulder, she was breathtakingly lovely. But more than that, he found himself drawn to her spirit, the way she refused to surrender to despair, even after everything she had endured. "You have been very kind to me," she said softly. "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not owe me anything," Mason replied. But even as he said it, He knew it was not entirely true. She did not owe him, but he found himself wanting something from her all the same. He wanted her to stay, wanted to keep hearing her voice fill the empty spaces in his cabin, wanted to see her smile. The realization unsettled him enough that he made an excuse and left the room, stepping out into the cold night air to clear his head. By the end of the first week, Thea was strong enough to leave the bed for short periods. Mason helped her to the main room, where she sat in the chair by the fire and looked around at his home with curious eyes. The cabin was simple but well built, with sturdy furniture and a cleanliness that spoke of a man who took pride in his surroundings. Books lined a shelf on one wall, and Thea exclaimed with delight when she saw them. "You read," she said, running her fingers along the spines. "I did not expect to find such a collection out here." "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Kansas," Mason explained. "She made sure I could read before she would let me do anything else. These were hers. I brought them when I came to Colorado." "What made you come here?" Thea asked, settling back into the chair with one of the volumes in her lap. Mason poured them both coffee and sat down across from her. "My father drank himself to death when I was 17. He lost our farm in Kansas through bad debts and worse decisions. After Ma passed a few years later, there was nothing left to keep me there. I had heard there was good grazing land out here for a man willing to work hard, so I came west and filed a homestead claim. I have been here 9 years now. It has not been easy, but this land is mine, and that means something." "You built all this yourself?" Thea looked at him with new respect. "The cabin, the ranch, everything." "With help," Mason admitted. "My hands are good men, and the neighbors pitch in when needed. That is how it works out here. We take care of each other because we have to. But yes, this is my doing. Every fence post, every beam in this roof. It is rough compared to what you are used to, I imagine." "It is honest," Thea said firmly, "and that is worth more than any fancy house bought with lies and pretension. You should be proud of what you have accomplished, Mason." The way she said his name sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He cleared his throat and changed the subject, asking about the book she had read, and they spent the next hour discussing literature like old friends. Mason was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her, how her opinions challenged him to think differently about things he had taken for granted. As February melted into March, Thea grew stronger every day. She began helping around the house, insisting that she needed to earn her keep, even though Mason protested. She cooked meals that were far better than anything he had managed on his own, mended his clothes with expert stitches, and organized his chaotic kitchen with ruthless efficiency. The cabin began to feel like a home in a way it never had before, filled with small touches that spoke of a woman's presence. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains at the windows, the smell of bread baking in the morning. Mason found himself inventing reasons to stay close to the house instead of riding out with his men. He told himself it was to make sure Thea did not overexert herself, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. He was falling in love with her, and he did not know what to do about it. The problem was that Thea had made it clear she intended to leave as soon as she was well enough. She talked often of finding work in Telluride, of somehow making her way in this new country. Mason understood her pride, her need to be independent, but the thought of her leaving made his chest ache. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to share his life with someone, and now that he had been reminded, he did not want to go back to the solitude. One afternoon in mid-March, as they sat on the porch watching storm clouds gather over the mountains, Thea brought up the subject directly. "I should go to town soon," she said, her voice careful. "I am well enough now, and I have imposed on your hospitality for too long." "You have not imposed," Mason said sharply, then softened his tone. "I mean it, Thea. You are welcome here as long as you want to stay." "But I cannot stay forever," she replied, and there was something in her expression that made his heart race. Was that regret he heard in her voice? Did she want to stay? "I need to find work, to make my own way. I cannot be a burden to you." "You are not a burden." Mason turned to face her fully, his hands gripping the porch rail. Thea, these past weeks have been the best I can remember in a long time. Having you here talking with you, it has made me realize how empty this place was before. I do not want you to leave. She looked at him with those honey-colored eyes, and he saw his own feelings reflected there. Mason, I cannot presume that you want me here permanently just because you are a kind man who saved my life. I have nothing to offer you. No money, no family, no prospects. I would be entirely dependent on your charity, and I cannot bear that. What if it was not charity? The words were out before Mason could stop them, and once he started, he could not seem to halt the flow. What if I asked you to stay as my wife? I know it is sudden and we have not known each other long, but Thea, I have never felt this way about anyone. You are smart and brave and beautiful, and you make this house feel like a home. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to build a life with you. Say yes. Please, say yes. Thea's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, a radiant expression that transformed her whole face. I should say it is too soon, that we barely know each other. I should be practical and sensible and all the things a proper Boston lady ought to be. But Mason, the truth is I have been falling in love with you since the first time you held a cup of water to my lips and told me I was safe. You are the finest man I have ever known, and yes, I will marry you. Yes, with my whole heart. Mason let out a breath he had not known he was holding and reached for her hands, pulling her up from her chair. He cupped her face in his work-roughened palms and kissed her softly, tenderly, as the first drops of rain began to fall around them. Thea kissed him back with a sweetness that made his head spin, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I will spend every day making sure you never regret this decision, he promised. I will take care of you, protect you, love you for as long as I draw breath. And I will make this house a home for you, Thea replied, her fingers tangled in his hair. I will stand beside you through whatever comes, and I will love you just as fiercely. We will build something good here, Mason. I know it. They were married 3 weeks later in Telluride's small church, with Walt and the other ranch hands serving as witnesses. Thea wore a simple dress of blue wool that one of the neighbor women had helped her make, and Mason wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The minister was an old Methodist circuit rider named Reverend Thompson who served several mountain communities, and he pronounced them husband and wife with a broad smile. The wedding night was gentle and sweet, with Mason taking great care to make sure Thea felt safe and cherished. They lay together afterward in the big bed, Thea's head on Mason's chest, his arms wrapped around her. Outside, the Colorado wind howled through the valley, but inside, they were warm and content. Tell me about your dreams, Mason said softly, running his fingers through her loose hair. What do you want from this life, Thea? She was quiet for a moment, thinking. I still want to teach, she admitted. There are children in this valley who need education. Maybe not in a formal school, not yet, but I could offer lessons. Would you mind that? Mind? I think it is a wonderful idea. We could clear out the old bunkhouse, set it up proper. You could teach there. Thea lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining. You would do that for me? I would do anything for you, Mason said simply, and knew it was the absolute truth. Spring came to the valley with a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers. Thea threw herself into fixing up the old bunkhouse that had stood empty since Mason's first hired hands had built themselves a larger cabin closer to the barn. She scrubbed and painted and organized, and Mason built desks and benches from rough-hewn lumber. Word spread through the community that the new Mrs. Lawson was offering lessons, and by May, Thea had 7 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Mason would often pause in his work to watch her through the bunkhouse window, seeing her animated face as she explained arithmetic or led the children through reading lessons. She had a gift for teaching, a patience and enthusiasm that drew the children to her. Their parents paid what they could, sometimes in coins, more often in eggs or vegetables, or offers to help with ranch work. It was not much, but Thea treasured every contribution, proud of what she was building. The summer passed in a blur of work and joy. Mason's cattle thrived on the mountain grass, and he was able to sell several head at good prices in Telluride. Thea's school grew to 10 students, and she began talking about the possibility of a real schoolhouse if the community could raise the funds. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains, talking about everything and nothing, simply content to be together. It was in late July that Thea realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she wanted to be certain before she told Mason. When she finally shared the news one evening over supper, his face went through a series of expressions so rapidly that she laughed out loud. "A baby?" he said, his voice almost awed. "We are going to have a baby. In February, I think," Thea confirmed, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Mason came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Thea, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and excited and grateful all at once. We are going to be parents." "We are," she agreed, and felt tears prick her eyes. Less than a year ago, she had been dying in a snowdrift, alone and hopeless. Now she had a husband she loved deeply, a home, work that fulfilled her, and a child on the way. Life could change so completely, so beautifully, in such a short time. Mason became even more protective as Thea's pregnancy progressed. He worried constantly that she was working too hard, that the children were too rowdy, that she was not eating enough. Thea found his concern endearing even when it bordered on excessive, and she made sure to reassure him regularly that she was fine. As autumn painted the mountains gold and red, Thea had to close her school temporarily. The children were needed for harvest anyway, and she was beginning to tire more easily. She spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, reading every book on childbirth she could get her hands on. Mason built a beautiful cradle from polished pine, working on it in the evenings with painstaking care. The first snow fell in late October, and Thea stood at the window watching the flakes drift down, remembering that terrible morning when she had collapsed in the cold. Mason came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, his hands resting on her growing belly. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "I am thinking that I would not change anything," Thea said. "Even knowing all the pain and fear I went through, I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." "I thank God for that snowdrift every day," Mason said quietly. "If I had gone after that mountain lion an hour earlier or later, if I had taken a different trail, I might never have found you. But you did find me." Thea turned in his arms to face him. "And you gave me back my life. You gave me everything I had ever dreamed of and so much more. I love you, Mason Lawson, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. And I love you, Thea Lawson. You are my heart, my home, my whole world." They kissed as the snow fell outside, and Thea felt the baby move beneath her hand, a flutter of life that promised the future they were building together. Winter settled over the valley with the same fierce intensity that had nearly claimed Thea's life a year ago. But now she was safe and warm, surrounded by love, and she did not fear the cold. Mason kept the fires blazing, and the cabin was cozy against the elements. They spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards, and talking about what they would name the baby. Christmas was a quiet affair, just the two of them and Walt, who had nowhere else to go. Thea cooked a feast despite Mason's protests that she should rest, and they exchanged simple gifts. Mason gave Thea a beautiful shawl he had bought in Telluride, soft wool in a deep green that brought out the gold in her eyes. Thea gave him a new shirt she had sewn, with delicate embroidery on the cuffs that must have taken hours of work. As the new year of 1885 dawned, Thea grew large and uncomfortable. She could not sleep well, could not find a comfortable position, and grew increasingly anxious about the approaching birth. Mason did his best to comfort her, but he was terrified himself, acutely aware of all the things that could go wrong. He arranged for the nearest midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who lived 5 miles away, to be ready to come at a moment's notice. The labor began on a bitter cold night in mid-February, almost exactly a year after Mason had found Thea in the snow. The pain started just after supper, and by midnight they were coming hard and fast. Mason rode through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Henderson, his heart in his throat the entire way. By the time he returned with the midwife, Thea was in the grip of something primal and fierce, and he had never felt so helpless in his life. Mrs. Henderson shooed him out of the bedroom, but he refused to go far. He paced the main room, listening to Thea's cries, feeling every one of them like a knife to his heart. Walt sat with him, offering silent support, occasionally pressing a cup of coffee into his shaking hands. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks with pink and gold light, a new sound filled the cabin, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn baby. Mason was through the bedroom door before Mrs. Henderson could stop him, and he found Thea propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "It is a boy," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with joy. "Mason, we have a son." Mason sank down on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the impossibly small face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they opened briefly, were a deep blue that might change or might stay. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, and a grip that was surprisingly strong when Mason offered his finger. "He is beautiful," Mason whispered, awestruck. "Thea, he is perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" Thea asked and carefully transferred the baby into Mason's arms. Mason had handled calves and foals and all manner of livestock, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of his own child, the awesome responsibility of this small life that depended entirely on him and Thea. He felt tears slip down his cheeks and did not bother to wipe them away. "Welcome to the world, little one," he said softly. "Your mama and I have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas William Lawson, after Thea's father and Mason's grandfather. Thomas was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs, and he kept them busy day and night. Thea took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though Mason could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He did what he could to help, walking Thomas when he fussed at night, changing diapers, rocking him to sleep so Thea could rest. As Thomas grew from a tiny newborn into a plump, alert baby, the cabin seemed to shrink. It had been fine for the two of them, but with a child and all the attendant equipment, it was cramped. One evening in late spring, as they sat outside watching Thomas try to grab his own toes, Mason brought up the subject that had been on his mind. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about adding on to the house. Maybe another bedroom, a larger kitchen. We could use the space now, and if God willing we have more children, we will need it." Thea looked at him with surprise and something else, something that looked like hope. "More children? You want more? Do you not?" Mason asked, suddenly uncertain. "I thought you would want Thomas to have brothers and sisters." "I do," Thea said quickly. "I just did not want to presume. I know how hard you work already, and another mouth to feed." "Thea Lawson, I will work myself into the ground happily if it means filling this house with children and laughter. I want a big family with you. I want to grow old watching our grandchildren play in this valley. Do not ever think that you or our babies are a burden to me." Thea leaned over and kissed him, Thomas squirming between them and making irritated noises at being squashed. They both laughed, and Mason felt his heart swell with contentment. This was what life was meant to be, he thought. Not easy, but full of love and purpose. That summer, Mason and his hired hands set about expanding the cabin. They added 2 bedrooms and enlarged the kitchen, and by autumn the house was twice its original size. Thea hung curtains and arranged furniture, making each room warm and welcoming. She reopened her school in September, and the number of students had grown to 15. Several of the older students from the previous year had spread the word about her teaching, and families from farther away were sending their children. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mason worked the ranch with his men, building his herd and improving his land. Thea taught during the day and cared for Thomas, who was growing like a weed and getting into everything. In the evenings, they would gather as a family, playing with Thomas, working on various projects, and simply enjoying each other's company. 2 years after Thomas was born, Thea gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Elizabeth. She had Thea's delicate features and a temperament as sweet as her name. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Mason had to admit that watching his son try to be gentle with the baby was one of the most endearing things he had ever seen. The years passed with the kind of steady contentment that Mason had never imagined possible in his youth. There were hard times, certainly. A drought in 1887 that forced him to sell some of his herd. A bad fall that Thomas took from a fence that resulted in a broken arm and a terrifying ride to fetch the doctor. An influenza epidemic that swept through the valley in 1889, sparing their family but taking several neighbors. But through it all, Mason and Thea faced each challenge together, their love growing deeper and stronger with every passing year. In 1890, Thea gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named James and Jacob. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, and afterward the doctor told them gently that there should be no more children. Thea was heartbroken, but Mason held her and reminded her that they had been blessed with 4 healthy, wonderful children, and that was more than many people ever got. Thomas was now 7, smart and curious, and already talking about being a rancher like his father. Grace was 5, with a talent for music that showed itself when Mason bought Thea a piano for their anniversary. The twins were a handful, identical in appearance but completely different in temperament. James was quiet and thoughtful, while Jacob was all energy and mischief. The school had become a permanent fixture in the valley, with Thea teaching and Mason serving on the board that oversaw it. They had managed to build a proper schoolhouse with donations and volunteer labor, and Thea now had 2 assistant teachers helping her manage the 25 students who attended. It had become more than just a school. It was a community center where meetings were held and celebrations took place. On their 10th anniversary, Mason took Thea on a trip to Denver, leaving the children in Walt's capable care. It was the first time they had been alone together since Thomas was born, and it felt strange and wonderful all at once. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at restaurants, and went to the theater. Thea bought new books, and Mason bought her a locket that she immediately filled with tiny photographs of their children. On their last night, as they prepared for bed, Thea came to stand beside Mason at the window overlooking the city. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me in, marrying me. Your life would have been so much simpler if you had just left me in that snowdrift." Mason turned to her, his expression fierce. "Thea Lawson, I have never regretted a single moment. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me. My life before you was empty, just going through the motions. You filled it with meaning and love and joy. Do not ever doubt that." "I do not really," Thea said, leaning into him. "I just wanted to hear you say it. These 10 years have been the happiest of my life, Mason. When I think about that girl dying in the snow, it feels like another lifetime, another person entirely. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Mason corrected gently. "I was just existing before you. You taught me how to really live." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of a couple who knew each other completely, who had weathered storms together and come out stronger. And the next day, they returned home to their children, to their ranch, to the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work. The 1890s brought changes to Colorado and to Telluride. The mining industry continued to boom, bringing more people and more prosperity to the region. The railroad reached closer, making it easier to ship cattle and bring in supplies. Mason's ranch continued to grow, and he was able to hire more hands and expand his operation. The family was comfortable now, not wealthy, but secure in a way that would have seemed impossible in those early struggling years. Thomas proved to be a natural with animals and spent every moment he could working alongside his father. By the time he was 12, he could rope and ride better than men twice his age, and Mason knew that the ranch would be in good hands when he was ready to pass it on. Grace discovered a love of teaching and often helped her mother at the school, showing the same patience and gift for instruction that Thea possessed. The twins were 10 now, still inseparable but developing their own distinct interests. James loved to read and could often be found with his nose in a book, while Jacob was always building something, taking things apart to see how they worked. In the spring of 1896, Telluride finally voted to establish a formal school district, and Thea was offered the position of head teacher at a salary that seemed extravagant. She was torn about accepting, worried about leaving the school she had built, but Mason encouraged her to take the opportunity. She deserved the recognition, he told her, and the new position would give her a chance to shape education policy for the entire valley. Thea accepted, and the Lawson School became part of the district system, with one of Thea's former assistants taking over as lead teacher. Thea threw herself into her new role with characteristic enthusiasm, working to standardize curriculum, train new teachers, and ensure that every child in the valley had access to education regardless of their family's circumstances. Mason was proud of her in a way that sometimes made his chest ache. The frightened, half-starved woman he had pulled from the snow had become a force to be reckoned with, respected throughout the valley for her intelligence and compassion. And yet she was still his Thea, still the woman who would curl up against him at night and talk about her dreams for the future. On a clear day in October 1898, as they celebrated their 14th anniversary, Mason saddled 2 horses and asked Thea to ride out with him. She was surprised, busy with school planning, but something in his expression made her agree. They rode up into the mountains, following the old trail that had nearly been her death. Mason had not been up this way in years, had deliberately avoided it, but today he had a purpose. They came to the place where he had found her, a broad stretch of trail beside a distinctive rock formation. The snow was long gone now, the ground covered in autumn grass and wildflowers. "This is where I found you," Mason said, dismounting. "Right here, face down in the snow. I thought you were dead at first." Thea slid down from her horse and came to stand beside him, looking at the spot with thoughtful eyes. "It is strange," she said. "I remember so little of that day. Just the cold and the certainty that I was dying. And then your voice pulling me back. I have thought about this place so many times over the years," Mason admitted, "about how close I came to losing you before I even knew you existed. If I had taken a different trail, if I had stayed home that day, our entire lives would be different. Thomas, Grace, the twins, none of them would exist. It is terrifying how thin the thread was." "But it did not break," Thea said, taking his hand. "The thread held, and here we are. 14 years married, 4 beautiful children, a life that is better than anything I could have imagined. Maybe it was luck, or fate, or God's will. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day." Mason pulled her close, holding her against his heart. "I love you, Thea. I loved you that first day when I did not even know your name, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Mason Lawson. You are my hero, my partner, my best friend, my everything." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, before finally mounting their horses and riding back down to the valley, to the home and family that had grown from such desperate beginnings. The turn of the century brought a sense of optimism and change. Thomas was now 17, a young man with his father's steady character and his mother's quick mind. He had courted a girl from town, a banker's daughter named Sarah, and Mason had no doubt that wedding bells would ring before too long. Grace was 15, beautiful and accomplished, already receiving attention from young men that made Mason want to lock her in her room until she was 30. The twins were 13, on the cusp of manhood themselves, full of plans and dreams about their futures. Thea had gray in her dark hair now, and Mason's hands were gnarled from years of hard work, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had fallen in love with all those years ago. If anything, time had only deepened their affection, adding layers of shared experience and mutual respect to the foundation of attraction and love. In 1902, Thomas married Sarah in a grand wedding that brought together families from all over the valley. Mason stood beside his son and remembered his own wedding, simple and small, and felt no envy. He and Thea had needed nothing but each other and their promises. Thomas and Sarah deserved the celebration their community wanted to give them. Thea cried through the whole ceremony, and Mason held her hand and blinked back his own tears. A year later, they became grandparents when Sarah gave birth to a baby girl named Margaret. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Mason felt the same awe and terror he had experienced with his own children. The cycle continuing, the family growing, the love multiplying. Grace surprised them all by announcing that she wanted to go to college in Denver to study music. It was an unusual choice for a woman in 1903, but Thea and Mason had always encouraged their children to pursue their passions. They took her to Denver themselves, helped her settle into the women's boarding house near the college, and cried all the way back to Telluride. The twins graduated from high school in 1905. James shocked no one by announcing he wanted to become a lawyer, while Jacob revealed plans to study engineering. Mason had worried that none of his children would want the ranch, would want to continue what he had built, but Thomas had already made his intentions clear. The ranch would stay in the family, growing and thriving under the next generation's care. As Thomas and Sarah settled into the expanded house, taking over more of the daily operations, Mason found himself with more free time than he had had in decades. He and Thea began taking trips, visiting Grace in Denver, exploring parts of Colorado they had never seen. They were not old, not yet, but they were aware that time was precious and should not be wasted. In the summer of 1908, on a warm June evening, Mason and Thea sat on the porch watching the sunset, much as they had done thousands of times before. Thomas and Sarah's children, now 3 in number, were playing in the yard. Grace was home for the summer, practicing piano inside. The twins were both home from their studies, arguing good-naturedly about something over by the barn. "We did well," Thea said softly, her hand in Mason's. "We built something good here." "We did," Mason agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you remember what I told you that first day I was strong enough to talk? When you asked me what I wanted from life, you said you wanted to teach," Mason replied. "And you did. You changed this whole valley with your schools." "I wanted more than that, even if I did not know it then," Thea said. "I wanted a home, a family, someone to love who would love me back. I wanted to matter to someone, and I got all of that and so much more. You gave me everything, Mason." "We gave each other everything," Mason corrected, bringing her hand to his lips. "I was half a man before you, Thea. You made me whole." As the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, they sat together in comfortable silence. 24 years of marriage, a lifetime of memories, and still they found peace in each other's presence. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Grace married a fellow musician in 1910 and moved to Denver permanently, though she visited often with her growing family. James passed the bar exam and opened a practice in Telluride, specializing in water rights and land disputes. Jacob took his engineering degree and went to work for the railroad, helping design the routes through the mountains. Thomas and Sarah had 5 children in total, and the ranch house rang with the noise and chaos of grandchildren. Mason taught his grandsons to ride and rope, passing on the skills his father had taught him so many years ago. Thea read stories to her granddaughters and taught them to sew and cook, creating the same kind of memories her own grandmother had given her. They watched their children become parents themselves, watched the family tree branch and grow in ways they could never have anticipated that day in the snow. In 1915, Mason and Thea celebrated their 31st anniversary with a party that brought together more than 100 people. Friends, neighbors, former students, family members came from near and far to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. There were speeches and gifts, and far too much food. And through it all, Mason kept Thea's hand in his, hardly able to believe that this was his life. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, they lay in bed together, as they had done for 3 decades. Thea's head was on Mason's chest, his arms around her, the familiar, comfortable position they always found in sleep. "Thank you," Thea whispered into the darkness, "for finding me, for saving me, for loving me all these years." "Thank you for saying yes," Mason replied, "for taking a chance on a rough cowboy with more dreams than sense, for making my life into something beautiful." "I would do it all again," Thea said. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy, all of it, just to end up here with you." "As would I," Mason agreed. "As would I." They drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other, and in the deep contentment of a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. Outside, the Colorado night was vast and star-filled, the mountains standing eternal watch over the valley below. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and Mason found great satisfaction in watching his son make his own decisions, his own mistakes, his own triumphs. He was there to offer advice when asked, but mostly stayed out of the way, content to play with his grandchildren and help Thea with her various projects. Thea had officially retired from the school district in 1916, but she could not stay away from education entirely. She started a program offering evening classes for adults who had never learned to read, and it filled a need that no one had realized existed. Men and women who had been too embarrassed to admit their illiteracy came to Thea in the privacy of the evening, and she taught them with the same patience and compassion she had shown her first students decades ago. In 1918, the influenza pandemic that was sweeping the world reached Colorado. It was a terrifying time, with families isolated to prevent the spread and death tolls mounting. The Lawson family was fortunate, only James catching a mild case, but they lost several neighbors and friends. It was a stark reminder that life was fragile, that the people you loved could be taken in an instant. Mason and Thea held each other closer during those dark months, grateful for every day they were given. They had been blessed with long lives and good health, but they were not young anymore. Mason was 61, Thea 56, and they could feel time's passage in their aching joints and failing eyesight. But their love had not diminished with age. If anything, it had grown more precious, more vital. In the spring of 1920, as the world slowly recovered from war and plague, Mason woke one morning to find Thea already up and standing at the bedroom window. She was looking out at the valley with an expression he could not quite read. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I was thinking about that girl in the snow," Thea said. "About how she had given up hope, was ready to die. I wish I could go back and tell her that everything was going to be all right, that she was going to find love and happiness beyond her wildest dreams, that the worst day of her life was actually the beginning of everything good." "She would not have believed you," Mason said with a smile. "She would have thought she was hallucinating from the cold." Thea laughed, that same musical laugh that had captivated him from the beginning. "Probably true, but Mason, I want you to know that every single moment of these 36 years with you has been a gift. You gave me life, and then you filled that life with meaning and joy. I could not have asked for a better husband, a better father for our children, a better partner in all things." Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thea, I am the one who was blessed. You took a lonely cowboy's cabin and turned it into a home. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You are the love of my life, the best part of me, and I thank God for every day I get to spend with you." They embraced there by the window, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from the ashes of despair. Outside, the valley was waking up, the ranch coming to life with the sounds of livestock and morning chores. Their grandchildren would soon be running through the house demanding breakfast and attention. Life would go on, busy and chaotic and beautiful. But for this moment, it was just the two of them, Mason and Thea, the cowboy, and the woman he had saved from the snow. Two souls who had found their home in each other, who had created a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. The years that followed were gentle ones. Mason and Thea became great-grandparents, watched their family continue to grow and branch. They took walks around the ranch on sunny days, sat on the porch on rainy ones, and counted each moment together as a blessing. They were old now, truly old, but they faced aging with the same partnership that had defined their marriage from the beginning. In the summer of 1925, as they approached their 41st anniversary, Thea suggested they take one last ride up to the place where Mason had found her. Thomas protested that it was too much for them, but Mason and Thea insisted. They were careful and slow, but they made it to the spot, dismounting stiffly and standing where their story had begun. 41 years, Thea marveled, looking around at the familiar landscape. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. "I remember every detail of that morning," Mason said. "The way the snow was falling, how scared I was when I realized you were barely alive. The way you opened your eyes and looked at me for the first time. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I did not know it yet. And I remember thinking, even half frozen and delirious, that you had the kindest eyes I had ever seen," Thea replied. "I remember feeling safe for the first time in months, maybe years. You were my salvation in every possible way." Mason Lawson. They stood together in the mountain silence, two old people holding hands and remembering their younger selves. Then Mason took something from his pocket, a small wooden box weathered with age. "I have been saving this," he said, opening it to reveal two pieces of paper, yellowed and fragile. "These are the vows we wrote to each other on our wedding day. I thought we could read them again, here where it all started." With trembling voices, they read the promises they had made to each other more than 4 decades ago. To love, to honor, to cherish, in sickness and health, in good times and bad, until death parted them. Simple words, but they had lived every single one of them, had made their vows real through years of dedication and devotion. When they finished, Mason carefully put the papers away and pulled Thea close. "I would marry you again right now," he said. "I would make all the same promises and mean them just as deeply." "As would I," Thea whispered. "You are my heart, Mason. You always have been, you always will be." They kissed there on the mountainside, two people who had loved each other through youth and middle age into their golden years. Then they mounted their horses and rode slowly back down to the valley, to the home they had built, to the family that was their legacy. The ride back was slower than it had ever been, but neither of them minded. They had all the time in the world, or at least all the time they needed. The sun was warm on their shoulders, and the valley stretched out before them, beautiful and familiar, and theirs. When they reached the ranch, their great-grandchildren came running to greet them, and Mason lifted the smallest one onto his lap while Thea told them stories about the old days. That evening, the whole family gathered for Sunday dinner, 3 generations filling the house with noise and laughter and love. As the sun set and the family slowly dispersed to their own homes, Mason and Thea found themselves alone on the porch once again. They sat in their rocking chairs, hands clasped between them, watching the stars come out one by one. "We did it," Thea said softly. "We built a good life, raised good children, left the world a little better than we found it." "We did," Mason agreed. "And I would not change a single thing." "Not one thing?" Thea teased gently. Not even that time Thomas fell in the creek and you dove in after him fully clothed? Mason chuckled. Well, maybe that. And possibly the time Jacob decided to see if he could train the rooster to come when called. They laughed together, comfortable with their shared history, all the little moments that had made up their life together, the struggles and triumphs, the laughter and tears, the ordinary days, and the extraordinary ones. It had all added up to something remarkable, something precious. As the night deepened and the mountain air grew cool, they went inside to their bedroom, the same room where Mason had first brought Thea when he pulled her from the snow. So much had changed since that day, but some things remained the same. The love between them, the trust, the deep knowing that came from spending a lifetime together. They settled into bed, and Thea curled against Mason's side as she had done for 41 years. His arms came around her automatically, and they lay there in the darkness listening to each other breathe. "I love you," Thea whispered, "forever and always." "I love you too," Mason replied, "with everything I am." And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other, and in peace, the Colorado wind whispered through the valley, carrying their story on its breath, a story of hope found in despair, of love growing from the seeds of compassion, of two people who had saved each other and built something beautiful from nothing but faith and determination. The ranch would continue after they were gone, passed down through the generations they had created. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would tell their story about the woman who collapsed in the snow and the cowboy who saved her, about how their love had shaped a family and a community. And somewhere in the mountains, on that stretch of trail where it all began, the wind would always blow, marking the place where Mason Lawson found Thea Carson and there forever started.